Okay, we're going to start the next session, which is a round table, given the rather ambitious, stroke pretentious title of Perspectives on Latin American Studies, New and Old Challenges and Opportunities. What I've asked our speakers to do, I've asked 5 people from a contrasting range of disciplines. What I've asked them to do is to speak for 5 minutes each on 2 questions. I'm going to introduce the speakers very briefly and then say what the questions are that I've asked them to think about. They're then going to present succinctly and briefly, allowing time for views from the audience as well, because I'm sure all of you will have ideas on these questions too. So our speakers are Françoise Barbera-Freeman, who's a medical anthropologist and working particularly on the Amazon. There's a lovely interview with Françoise on the Media Project's website, by the way. She was a research officer at the centre in the late 1970s. And then we have Charles Jones, who's a specialist in international relations and a former director of the centre. Sitting next to Jeffrey Cantares, who's also a former director of the centre, based in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and he works particularly on urban culture and cinema. And then Felipe Hernandez, who's a lecturer in architectural design, history and theory. And then Gabriela Ramos, who's a specialist in the colonial history of the Andes. And the questions I've asked them to think about are firstly, what are the major changes that you've seen in Latin American studies since you began your career? Either thinking about the UK context or more broadly, depending on the context that they're able to talk about. And secondly, in what ways has the work of Latin Americanists produced disruptions or brought about revisions in the theories or practices that have shaped your discipline or disciplines? So I think I've had 2 requests to go near the end, which by default means that I think we'll start with Charles.
Oh, really? Well, thank you. Can I start then, first of all, by insulting the chair, which is always a good way to sort of get going. I'll set my timer going very quickly. There we go. You introduced me as a specialist in international relations. Well, of course, I'm a historian.
I almost said historian of Latin American relations.
And, well, that's very kind of you. The point is, I've spent my career entirely in departments or faculties ending in the word studies. Commonwealth Studies, Latin American Studies, Joint School of Spanish at Warwick, and so on. I am not going to talk about history. I will talk about international relations. And I defer to Gabriela as by far the more, having the better claim to talk about history. But I think it is worth saying in this context of talking about interdisciplinarity that my career has been that. It has been one of sort of shifting around in murky areas and crossing disciplinary boundaries. International relations I see as a field, not a discipline, in no way a discipline. That, of course, is contrary to a certain sort of North American view, which would say it's part of political science. Note that in this department we have a Department of Politics and International Studies, not of political science or international relations. So first question, I think I can deal with pretty briefly, because I've seen one shift, which can be characterized in different ways, but I do think it has been one shift along a spectrum. It could be seen as going from the material to the cultural with possible suffixes of ist or ism. It could be seen as moving from a focus on, a world of basically criollo states to the preoccupation we've seen already this morning with the indigenous peoples of the America. I was going to say Americas plural, but that's another issue. And then I usually use the word positivist quite precisely and as a term of abuse. But if I were to use it loosely and in a less pejorative way, I'd say it's a movement from positivism towards various forms of post-positivism. Now, I think I've given 3 characterizations, but I think it's the same thing. And what fascinates me is the way in which this happens sociologically, that naturally people have a tendency to want to replicate themselves through appointments, through the approval of doctoral theses and so on. But I think all the time the shift has been taking place by selection panels, examiners and so on, saying, do you know, that's a little bit different to what I do, but my goodness, it is good. And so the shift takes place, I wouldn't say reluctantly at all. Well, that may be the case in some places. Generally, it takes place with the full approbation of an older generation, and it is an irresistible accommodation to change. How am I doing? Oh, got no time at all left. Right, okay. The second bit, what's happened to international relations? Well, as many of you know, it's tended to be very United States dominated, and to just think every place is the same all over the world, and to think of the power relations between different states in a very systematic way. There is then another school, sometimes called International Society School, sometimes called the English School, which says, no. Norms and institutions are important. And for those people, among whom I number myself, but also people like Arlene Tickner in Bogota, or Federico Merca in Buenos Aires, Ari Kakovitz, who's very explicitly English school. The Latin American world of settler states presents something that is very like Europe but different. It has actually much more regard for and invention of international law. It has fewer interstate wars, etc., etc. So it can be used, and I've used it in teaching here at master's level, as a kind of foil for the idea that Europe is the paradigm and it has then spread worldwide. There is another slightly more subversive, and I think I've got a few seconds to say this, shift that's begun to take place towards saying, well, and this is the indigenous influence coming into international relations, to say, well, what if international relations had been invented in America, the Americas, but had been the study of relations between Creole and indigenous polities? That's to say, if it had been something quite different. And this, like the first one, is, thank you. Sorry about the vulgarity of that. What I'm talking about, of course, are implicit critiques of the North American orthodoxy that use Latin America in various ways, all of which actually bounce off the orthodoxy pretty much, but we go on, banging away.
Thank you. Could you pass your very useful counter to Geoffrey, unless you've got unless you've also got a similarly amusing.
Is it just a minute?
You're done before now, because I picked
speed
one of yours.
dating.
Is it me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So what I want to interrogate today really is this question of how we conceptualise Latin America as a real or imagined space, or as a superset of space of places within our disciplines. So my own discipline is cultural studies, which specialises on the interface between imagined communities and the various symbolic productions of such communities. So I guess that over the time I've been working on Latin America since the late 1980s, I've seen a few super cycles, to use a word borrowed from commodities markets, concerned with mineral extraction, that still fuels one of the fundamental ways in which the developed world relates to Latin America. So the super cycle I'm going to focus on concerns questions of identity, which is another way of saying difference. So when I first began working on Latin America, the contestation of identity was all the rage. But it was an abstract concept of statist, or, depending on one's feminist credentials, patriarchal identity that had been poisoned by years of authoritarian rule, or dictatorships which had attempted to put the clock back on burgeoning social movements, as well as on militant demands for a radical redistribution of wealth, the breaking of the monopolisation of the means of production by a predatory elite. So out of the ashes of Marxist militancy and the hopes that had been inspired by the Cuban Revolution, there emerged in the humanities and the social sciences a sense that the terrain of contestation needed to shift from the economic terrain to the cultural. Instead of combating the monopolisation of the means of production, since that battle had been roundly lost, it might instead be possible to challenge social inequalities by questioning identitarian structures and reconfiguring them. So many of us Latin Americanist culturalists have been brought up, so to speak, in an academic environment where much radical energy was being poured into post-structuralism. much to the horror of the cultural Marxists, who saw it as a compensatory fiction born out of the various revolutionary defeats of 1968. But in the 1990s, it was exciting to find Latin Americans having emerged from dictatorship and engaging in radical and self-styled subversive forms of identity politics, which seemed to offer new configurations of post-Marxist freedom. In academia, theory had replaced Marxism as the terrain of radical cultural politics, and this seemed to coincide with new democratic movements in Latin America that were also leaving the Cold War behind. So the optimism couldn't last, of course. A dawning realization that the radical outpouring of democracy was being gradually subsumed into what we'd not yet begun to call neoliberal economic models instigated a crisis in the contestatory paradigm of identity politics. At the same time, theory was increasingly being viewed with suspicion as a discourse which brought into a universal model of culture, which belied the multiplicity and specificity of the various national and subnational cultures in a complex region such as Latin America. So this was born of the rhetoric out of this was born this notion of specificity, which became a code word for a kind of resurgent and maybe slightly depressing form of cultural nationalism. Cultural studies in and on Latin America became torn between, on the one hand, those who affirm the continued role, culture's continued role as a filter of national imaginaries, gaining its intelligibility largely from its critical relationship to national hegemonic processes and their periodic crises, and those who prefer to emphasize the centrifugal cultural forces that rupture the neat circle of identity and culture. So these latter accounts prioritize the transnational circuits of production and, above all, reception of even the most staunchly national cultural forms. Like most dichotomies, this academic dispute, which still persists in many ways since the turn of the millennium, is largely false. And a small shift of perspective is enough to realise that both sides of the argument are performative and serve entrenched academic and national politico-cultural interests. So when we promulgate the metaphor of Latin America as a space of indiscipline, what we really mean is that we have this special region of the world that is different and disruptive, but this space of disruption sustains our specialism and requires specialist tools and knowledge, which cannot be subsumed into global theoretical models of social and cultural processes, disrupting them productively. This discourse of academic difference, and includes the national apparatuses of cultural criticism, selection and financing, where these exist, as well as the interests of national and international university departments and centres of Latin American studies that facilitate the study of Latin American culture, demand the construction of this uniquely specific set of objects carved out of post-colonial national imaginaries that can be differentiated one from the other and around which specialist knowledge can be constructed. So for academics such as us, whose specialisations are vested in the affirmation of cultural difference, cultural production is most easily read within this frame of specificity and indiscipline. Yet, as Arjuna Padurai memorably put it, one man's imagined community is another man's political prison. Despite our need to claim the terrain of difference, which underlines the notion of indiscipline, and which is really the bulwark of disciplinary needs, identitarian paradigms are everywhere in crisis. So in Latin Americanist cultural theory, from the 2000s onwards, various voices began to declare the exhaustion of paradigms of identity and difference. Declarations which accompany a rise, the idea of the rise of the network society, and the slow reorientation of the final referent of culture from nation to network. So I think we need to think beyond the cultural deadlocks produced by the crisis of the nation state, the neoliberal end of ideology and history, entrenched national politico-cultural interests, and the celebration of network struggle and global digital cultures. So this involves moving beyond the impulses and cycles of the national popular, revived briefly in the so-called Marea Rosada, versus the transnational multicultural divide, what John Beverley terms identity politics versus radical multiculturalism. So we only have fragmentary theories and conceptual tools to understand this reconfiguration. Instead of autonomy, representation, commodification, and power, for example, cultural forms will need to contend with connection and disconnection, with distributed agency, with the direction of flow and control. But we can be sure that these new topographies in Latin America, as much as elsewhere, will reorientate the entire terrain of culture, its patterns of consumption and its framing within the informational flows of the network society.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Gabriella, do you want to speak next?
I specialize in the history of colonial Latin America, and I have been teaching the history of colonial Latin America in this university for a few years. Every year I feel there are days when I think that if I have to speak about Christopher Columbus again and all that stories, I'm going to, start screaming, because it's like going back to this storytelling. But interestingly, every year after I have sort of alerted myself against this idea that I'm repeating something, I come out with the experience that this is such a fascinating story. It's so important in order to understand who we are as Latin Americans, that there's always something like an angle, comment or question that someone makes or asks that makes you reconsider the whole story, or that makes you just think that it's important to continue talking about that period and what happened at the time. So there are different views about what do colonial historians what is the value of what we do, what is the actuality. I do find colleagues or people in general that think that I sort of take refuge in places and times that have no longer much interest, and it's a way of escaping the reality. And at the same time, when I do embark into reading some new book or revising some old stuff that has been written, I still feel the force, the vibrancy of what I myself and other colleagues that are interested in this period think about. And I think this is the reason also why this is so important is because it's an area where there is so much tension. I have recently finally finished and published a small piece, which is a historiographical review of the historiography around the theme of conversion to Christianity in the Andean area. And my point was to reflect on the role that politics have in the interpretation that we make of this story. It is very difficult to talk about these things that are already gone. I mean, they happened 500 years ago, etc., etc., but it's so difficult to speak about it today. And that is the point I'm trying to make, because if you present this sort of black and white version of Indians versus Spaniards, victims and aggressors, and this sort of essentialist view, then that is safe, that is okay, that's something that most people can understand, and that you can sort of appear really well towards a number of audiences. But if you start looking at the nuances and the problems inside, then you can run into big trouble. So I reflected about that. I come from, my academic career started in an atmosphere where this black and white view predominated, and I have seen the development of this other approach. But still, even though this new, more interesting approach of looking at the nuances and looking at from a definitely more critical viewpoint, the role of different agents in the story of conquest and colonization, the other view, the black and white, continues alive and kicking. And this is the one that most people like. So I reflect on that in that piece that I published rather recently. So because I know I have very little time, and probably I have already used most of it, I think what I would like to, a couple of questions I would like to throw here, and I was thinking of commenting a few titles, but perhaps that is not going to be that interesting, is that perhaps reflecting about what we do in the social sciences in Latin America, perhaps asking what we can say today about either the present or the past. And who is allowed to say some critical things? I was just talking to a colleague during lunch. For instance, I was saying that to some extent I do feel safe to say certain things simply because I am not white. So I can speak, for instance, about the Indian conquistadors, all the collaborators of the Spaniards. I can speak about, as I did in previous work, about all the people that actually bought into the colonial system. They enthusiastically engaged into the colonial system. That also they learned all the tricks of and all the rules, for instance, of something that is so Latin American, which is the practice of racism. But there are some other colleagues of mine that cannot speak about that because otherwise the audience is going to go and listen immediately. So I think I would like to, perhaps if it's possible, to talk a little bit about this, because I would be interested in exploring the extent to which we can sort of get out from these prisons of certain discourses that make us feel safe, but they are maybe comfortable, but at the same time, I think they do limit us. Limit us from having a real, an honest intellectual exchange. What is the role of politics in what we do? In what we can do. Sorry if I have taken...
No, that's great, and hopefully we will get a chance at the end to come back to some of those ideas. Felipe?
Well, I suppose since everybody started declaring their disciplinary field, I suppose I have
You don't have to.
I do have to declare that I'm an architect, and I say these because architecture has been somewhat tangential to all these much more deeper and academic debates around Latin America that started in the 1950s and 60s, and all this the question about Latin American theory and studies. And I suppose it would be a good idea to say anecdotally, now that we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Center for Latin American Studies, that the Center for Latin American Studies class is only 6 years younger than Brasilia. And this is interesting because in the introduction of her book, Building the New World, Valerie Fraser says that the inauguration of Brasilia in 1960 marked the end of a period of fascination with Latin American architecture that started with the Brazil Builds exhibition in MoMA in New York 20 years earlier before the inauguration of Brasilia. Until then, the study of Latin American architecture had focused almost entirely on the ways in which Latin American architects appropriated techniques and forms and practices that were used by other architects in North America, in Europe, and how they also, through their practices, contributed to the development of modern architecture. But from that moment on, after the end of this period of fascination with form and the start of Latin American studies with the creation of the first centers for Latin American studies in the United States and Canada, and here, of course, you know that the LASA, the Latin American Studies Association, also celebrated the 50th anniversary this year. It's almost this moment of Latin American studies. The focus on the understanding and the interpretation of architectural practices in Latin America has shifted. If something, it has become more nuanced. And rather than looking into forms only and the ways in which Latin American architects interpret the work of others around the world, it has become very interested in issues to do with the politics of the Latin American city, the socioeconomic differences, issues to do with race, for example, and history. All those aspects have permeated in the study of Latin American cities and Latin American architecture, and it's something, it has become much more complex. In that sense, I think it has changed the way in which we see the practice of architecture. And I suppose in relation to to the second question, is the fact that these more nuanced understanding of architectural practices and urban design practices have translated into, or have been able to, or have forced, as it were, architects to challenge the more narrow definitions of what a city is and what buildings do for people. And I think that has translated in some of the recent insertions, if you like, in cities like Curitiba, for example, or Rio de Janeiro, Bogota, Medellin, where urban plans and new policies and new buildings and transport systems have been implemented, inserted in the fabric, and have begun to, even if only partially and just gradually and very slowly, change the way in which people understand cities, live in cities, and can just really generate new transformations. So I think these, in that sense, that answers the second question in the sense that we begin to think about cities, our cities in Latin America, in ways that are different from the way we thought 50, 60 years ago.
Thank you very much. Françoise, we've got some images as well to share.
Can they be full screen? They're not in the right order. When I joined class in 1978 as the first female research officer, little did I know that I was on the crest of a first wave of Amazonian development, and as we organized the first international conference on development versus conservation in Amazonia, the subsequent sequels of internal migration, hydroelectric dams, and mining projects extended our Cambridge watershed conversations into a continuous stream of social, political, and economic publications to this day. So Amazonia, in the last 3 decades, has become, in a way, the provocative in-discipline center stage of many discussions in anthropology and also in about development and conservation. And it's Rio 2012 and Rio 2020 are very good demonstrations of this. While contracts have been signed in closed rooms between multinational corporations and national government, and a blind eye was turned on illegal traffickers and is turned of national resources or drugs, the role of political activists in NGOs in collaboration with both national and foreign social scientists has become more salient in the last 2 decades. My engagement is in longitudinal field research as an anthropologist in the Peruvian Amazon in a way illustrates the points made by both Charles and Jeffrey. I witnessed firsthand the rise of Sendero Luminoso, then the eradication of coca by US-backed Peruvian forces and its substitution in the form of fair trade coffee cooperative. That's the one. Oro Verde. And recently, the recruitment of Forest Quechua young men in their century-old role of opening forest trails now towards mining projects in the Camisea. The Yacumamay forest community of 11,000 hectares that I set up with 2 Quechua migrant communities near Iquitos in Peru in 1996 with links to Cambridge University turned out to be a microcosm of the social processes in Amazonia over the last 2 decades. So to answer Felipe, the population of Amazonia is now 80% urban, but there is no architecture in them. They are sprawling shanty towns. But very few people realize that Amazonia is actually urban. So our reserve, after a losing battle against encroaching migrants, Colombian drug traffickers, and the challenges of hosting Chinese students sent by their parents to study Amazonian ecology in Peru, the reserve has finally been reverted to the States 3 weeks ago, completing a cycle of colonization and deforestation of forests turned into plots for migrant settlers, who of course will not eco-living. So the process is less than 100 miles away. The Pacaya Samiria National Park, said by Richard Bodmer from the University of Kent, heralds the forms of that conversation has now mostly taken in Amazonia. Parks without people, or parks in which humans are tolerated. But since the use of subsoil remains at discretion of states, the Yasuni examples of such as the Yasuni Park in Ecuador or the Cordillera Azul in Peru show the precarious state of still the precarious state of conservation in Amazonia. The way in which ecotourism overlaps with conservation brings out the rising importance of indigeneity in the last 3 decades. And indigeneity as self-ascribed social identity of indigenous people, in contrast with race, ethnicity, or indigenism, is undoubtedly one of the most salient emerging new social movements in Latin America in the last decades. So tribes have renamed themselves, and in the wake of anthropological publications concerned with time and history in the Amazon, forest people have become self-reflective. They have started to produce their own books. Special university courses and higher education programs have been developed on the basis of indigeneity, and their negotiation with shamanism and Christianity, particularly in the still expanding Protestant evangelical churches in Amazonia, has taken a variety of forms in each of the 7 countries. In each successive decade of the last century, access to areas inhabited by indigenous forest people has become increasingly difficult, and made even more difficult by groups who have opted for self-isolation. So the flurry of publications in Amazonian anthropology, certainly dominated by Eduardo Vivero de Castro's perspectivism, as we have heard from Sean this morning. But there is a new generation of anthropologists in Europe and Latin America, and particularly in Brazil, who have increasingly focused on the relation between indigenous groups among one another and with the dominant society. So in this respect, the links with archaeology have become very salient, and some prevailing Amazonian myths, such as the one of the El Dorado, reported by early travelers, may or may not collude with recent paleoarchaeological finds in the region, and this is possibly the most interesting research breakthrough of the last 50 years following the pioneering work of Betty Meggers. So this has given way to interdisciplinary studies. My interest in plant medicines and healthcare in Amazonia has led to my can we get the next slide? To my involvement this one. To my involvement with the discovery of a novel local anesthetic plant used in dentistry. So this is our team in Peru, in Cayetano Heredia University. So this is a case study of an international network since clinical trials are increasingly done in Latin America. And the popularity of products, some of which are sold in the Amazon, some of which in health food shops, has taken a remarkable development in the last 2 decades. So this is all done through the University of Cambridge, and we have a spin-out company that is engaged in drug discovery together with Latin American partners. So these global networks have actually a rooted reality in this class, indirectly in class.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you all to our speakers for a really fantastic, diverse range of responses to that question. And I would like to extend this session by a few minutes just to allow responses from you, really, because there may be something of what you've heard that you would like to ask more about, or to give your own views or perspectives, or you may have your own responses as well to the broader questions that I asked at the beginning. Anyone want to? Yes, right at the back.
Sorry, yeah, I don't know if you could hear me. So I just wanted to, probably that gives us all opportunity to go hacer uso de la palabra. No? So it struck me that obviously our study of the past is framed by what's going on in the present, and there are two things that seem to be framing certainly the study of history, but also seem to study of anthropology and sociology and political science. One is what I suppose we could call the ambiguities of neo and liberalism. So seeing both the fact that capitalism both involves high degrees of exploitation in Latin America, but also the acknowledgement that it also creates liberation for certain people. And probably best expressed recently, I saw in the film Cartel Land, right, where if you saw Cartel Land, it's very clear that the drug trafficking of peasant members of Michoacan communities was class warfare. That they were doing this in order to liberate themselves from a life that was otherwise being stuck with a kind of peasant worker for the rest of their life. They take up a gun and start producing methamphetamine. And the second thing I would say is violence. So 42 of the top 50 violent cities in the world are in Latin America. And I think these two ideas are certainly kind of framing the way that historians are looking at Latin America, looking at the roots of these, or seeing them as very novel phenomena. So I was wondering if any of you could speak about this in your own fields. And I'm reminded actually of a particularly book I've just finished by Stephen Cassandri. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, an Argentine historian who's been looking at, who's a kind of cultural historian, but has been looking at how to integrate the study of violence into the study of culture. There's a very interesting thing on advertising and crime and violence in Argentina.
Any responses, either from the panel or anybody else from
Yeah,
the room?
anyone who really wants to speak about those two issues.
Yeah.
To introduce some confusion in this, I have bad news for everybody. Latin America has become inferno. Inferno. De Dante. Y lo digo porque escuchando las lecturas disciplinarias me doy cuenta que América Latina se ha vuelto ilegible. Y el infierno no es infierno porque hace mucho calor, es infierno porque está desarticulado y no se puede leer. Y entre uno y otro piso se requiere un guía que lo lleve a uno. Y entonces el conjunto del infierno es infernal porque es impensable. Y creo que América Latina se ha vuelto impensable, no gracias a nosotros, estamos tratando de leerla de alguna manera productiva, ¿no? Pero hablando de violencia, hay que hablar de corrupción. Y estamos acostumbrados a hablar de América Latina como una genealogía. Viene de esto, sigue en lo otro, y explicamos a los seres humanos como productos de una historia como racional. Y es una historia violentísima. Y lo que no hablamos es del futuro, que yo creo que deberíamos convertirnos los latinoamericanistas en estudiantes del futuro, porque el único sentido que puede tener América Latina es en su despliegue de horizontes nuevos posibles, que son la rehumanización y el control de lo infernal, para ser legibles. No nos vamos a convertir en misioneros, pero creo que nuestras lecturas podrían contribuir algo a eso.
Adriana, first Gabriela,
Sorry,
and then
but I disagree with what you are saying. Perhaps the infierno is fine, but I think we have to take into account the fact that Latin America has suffered terribly and has been the scenario of terrible violence because this idea of thinking about the future, thinking about utopia, is one of the worst.
Utopia es diferente.
No, but this is the way in which it has been phrased.
Ah, ya,
No?
ok.
And so we are just, I think, sort of trying to come out from that nightmare. So I think that we have to think about the present and that we need to know more about our past. Thinking about the future is, I think it
But the
will take us
present-
again into yet another nightmare that in the past was conducted by some, different ideologies. Some people blame Marxism and others, well, anyway, we can talk a long time about that. But I think it's really dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Having lived in Latin America for most of my life, I think I can say that it's like someone who is sort of far away, cannot really have an understanding of what it means to call for thinking about the future. When you live that present, then or that recent past is another
Can
story.
you- Adrian-
The present is our construction of the future, of course.
Yeah. Adrian, David, and then maybe from another corner of the room.
Just to say that I think that the idea of infern is just a problem of perspective. We thought that we knew what Latin America is or was, and we were wrong. Latin America is not Latin America, and the first problem is to continue thinking that Latin America is a unity, and we can find the solution to to crack this enigma, and it's not. It's a continent, and it is a very complex and heterogeneous continent. And I think that the infant is the answer when we realize that it is different than we thought it was. And I think we have to start to think in a different way.
David.
Oh, briefly, I wonder if any of the panel have any comments about the way in which the phenomenon of Trump, Brexit, Le Pen may make...
It's another infierno.
No.
It's another conference.
How it might make them think differently about Latin America.
Oh, okay.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I'm not asking you to.
Maybe if one or two would like to.
Well, setting tact to one side, I can see that there are a number of things in the United States, in Britain, which are symptoms which anyone who's studied Latin America would recognize as symptoms of populist politics. And I hazarded that in a conversation with someone recently and said, well, think about Venezuela. And the answer was, that's irrelevant to us. That's a Latin American country. As though somehow that means that it can have no lessons for developed European post-industrial. That is crazy. Second response to what's being said, I completely agree with you, Adrian, that to generalize about Latin America is hopeless in a way. But one of the functions it has politically, and this goes back to the question of violence raised by Ben, is that to use that category conceals the commonalities of levels of religiosity, violence, homicide, and so on, that make the United States the most exceptional of Latin American countries. I would say the most deviant of Latin American countries, if you want to think in terms of the Americas as one continent. You said continent, but you didn't mean the whole continent, I think. So, I find it useful to think about the United States in that way.
One or two more questions or comments, if there are any. If not, we will stick vaguely schedule and thank our speakers and move on now to hear from